Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jason Lariviere's Compression, a Philosophical and Technical Introduction seminar. In this introductory seminar, participants will be familiarized with the political stakes of a media theory of compression. The seminar will rigorously consider the implications of compression, both as a concept and a technical process with a specific history. The participants are asked to think about the epistemological consequences of a shrinking world and expanding data for our media ecology and our politics. Geert Lovnik and Mark Tudors, for example, suggest that our current political emergency might have something to do with the power of compressed ideas in the form of memes, such as those that helped put Donald Trump in the White House. As Lovnik and Tudors suggest, it is in fact the reactionary right that has been most successful in recent years with their often repeated slogan that politics is downstream from culture. If the forces of political reaction have been the ones to apply the politics of idea compression for their own ends, the liberal imagination, in everything from Democratic Party campaign strategies to digital humanities departments in the university, has been captured by big data. The seminar explores how, in addition to using data analysis and complex computational operations, smaller data streams are desired for a revitalized political project on the left. In the era of oversaturated media environments, perhaps a compression of thought is needed now more than ever. The seminar will also consider concerns related to compression and their aesthetic implications like resolution, fidelity, and definition. The seminar's professor is Jason Lariviere. He recently completed his PhD in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. He also holds a Master in Film Studies from Columbia University, and his writing has appeared in Boundary 2, Efflux, Parrhesia, and the Brooklyn Rail. Without further ado, I'll pass the mic on to Jason to begin the presentation. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Mohammed, and welcome everyone to the first session of the seminar on compression as a technical and philosophical concept. And this really is going to be an introduction to these ideas. So I'm not assuming any philosophical background necessarily, or certainly any technical background. So we're going to really be starting with kind of first steps, and hopefully we can all learn these concepts together as we go along. And maybe just a little background on how I came to working on these ideas and thinking about again, this dual track approach to compression, both again as a kind of concept in philosophy, in political philosophy even, and the technical, really engineering, communications engineering background that it comes out of. Basically, it was through conversations with Alexander Galloway, who became my advisor at NYU. And indeed, we both co-authored a piece called Compression in Philosophy, which considers that one, the more conceptual aspect of the project in depth. And I'm not like assigning that, but if anyone's interested to read it, I can certainly send anyone who is interested a PDF of that as well. So yeah, I
say that prior to the beginning of a class, we shared that article with public on our page and everywhere. So we publicized it. Oh, lovely cup you have, by the way. I'm sorry, I'm just like very like diversionary. Yes. Anyways, I apologize.
Oh, great. No, I didn't really. You told me that, I think, but I forgot. So yes, compression in philosophy. It was actually, it's a little weird to read it out of context because it was a part of a special issue on Bernard Stiegler's aesthetics, where we kind of just shoehorn our own agenda about compression into this special issue on Bernard Stiegler. who I'm sure I'll mention in some of these classes. So anyway, if anyone's interested in the conceptual side of this two-track approach, you can check that out. So in the one sense, I'm interested in thinking about compression as a way that semantic and epistemological content is organized. How we approach epistemology, in philosophy and just generally in the humanities now. And the next part of the project is to look at certain issues in neuroscience and cognitive science, and to see how compression might be a way to think about what's happening neurologically as well. So that's a little bit down the road. But then the engineering side of this, comes out of an interest in what the department, PhD department that I would come out of is really kind of specializing in nowadays, which is so-called media materiality, right? So looking at the kind of issues around infrastructure, hardware, the stuff of the networks of media. So compression really is an engineering question in communications, and I think you get this from Stern's loose history of compression article, which I sort of assigned for this first session because I think it really is just a nice introduction to a lot of the issues that we can talk about more in depth, right? But it's particularly this relationship between infrastructure and representation, right? And how those are in this a transductive relationship with each other, right? How they are constituted in the relationship with each other. So we can talk about that more. And yeah, what I do in the dissertation is to consider both the engineering side and the philosophical conceptual side through a variety of case studies. And I thought what I might do, just by way of introducing myself and my project and how I'm kind of approaching this, is read sort of like my book pitch, how I see my own work in this area, how I frame it so far, and where I see it going forward. And then what I thought we could do is just sort of go around and introduce each other and talk about how we might be coming to this topic individually. So here's my kind of framing of my own work in this area. It's a short couple paragraphs, but just to give you, a sense of what I've done on the topic and where I see it going forward as I think about turning the dissertation into a book, right? So I say, in this project, I consider the ways in which contemporary viewers expect a certain type of image in the current media ecology, an image produced through a series of engineering, infrastructural, and aesthetic compromises. I call this the compression image. This project provides an intervention into a media theoretical history of lossy images at a time when data compression as a fact of our digital lives is gaining popular purchase. And everything from sitcoms like Silicon Valley to music streaming services like Tidal, interesting compression or hype around the lack thereof seems to be proliferating. So far, a robust intervention into the perceptual techniques of image compression has eluded media studies. My project seeks to fill that gap. The 4 chapters of my dissertation consider image compression as a form of cultural technique at varying orders of magnitude, from the mathematical principles that are built into video codecs to proleptic markers of computationalism in 1970s science fiction cinema, to discourses around home theater technology in the 1990s, and finally to new media art since the turn of the millennium. Understanding the ways in which an ideology of good enough quality emerges in visual culture guides the case studies across a range of historical sites and research methods. I also consider how compression schemas mediate between the analog and the digital, the signal and the sign, the native and the quantized. an isomorphic relationship between the technical specifications of image compression and philosophical concepts about the binary nature of the world generates the aesthetico-political idea of lossy elegance, which is the term that I've coined, the idea of lossy elegance that lies at the heart of the project. Compression in moving images is considered as both qualitative and quantitative rounding off, a metaphorical process of aesthetic reduction and sensuous impoverishment, and a materialist poetics of signal processing, pointing to a political horizon beyond the enframing logics of compression. This project, situated at the intersection of film and media theory, science studies, cultural studies, digital humanities, and philosophy of technology, will make a unique contribution to the field of film and media studies. The project is among the first to attempt to bridge two broadly disparate approaches to technical mediation, represented by the work of two members of my dissertation committee. The history of science and technology, with a special emphasis on psychophysics and perceptual coding practiced by Mara Mills, and a speculative process philosophical inquiry into post-perceptual microtemporal mediation, represented by Mark B.N. Hansen. Taking inspiration from Marxist historical materialism, as well as the various new forms of materialism that have had an impact in theoretical discourses across the humanities over the past years. The book project could be considered part of the post-hermeneutical turn to media materiality. I temper this move, however, with a commitment to fine-grained attention to the material semiotic experiential side of the screen. A media archaeological investment in the stuff of media then merges with more speculative aesthetic questions about what digital computational media is doing to the human sensorium at an individual level, and how those scales can be expanded to include geopolitical repercussions. So that's a little preview for you all of what might be coming in the next few years if I get around to writing a book about this project, which hopefully happens soon. And yeah, you'll see here my kind of intervention was to do the like MPEG version of Stern's book, right? He writes MP3, the meaning of a format, which of course is largely about audio compression in the MP3, and my contribution was to do like the video image version of that, tell the video version of that history. So I'm proposing the compression image as this kind of emblematic image of contemporary visual culture in our current media ecology. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, thinking about these issues, with a specific emphasis on that history. But then, of course, I'm also more broadly interested in thinking compression along these like larger conceptual abstract terms. And in that article I wrote with Galloway, we talk about this idea of abstract compression, which is this long durée concept of history that we could think about. A lot of cultural techniques along the lines of compression. So we'll have ample chance to talk about that in more detail. So I guess what I would be interested in doing now is hearing from everyone else and introducing yourself, and it's a little bit about yourself, where you are in the world, what you do, and what makes you interested in these concepts. So,
Jhemini, do you want to start?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Jhemini. I am currently in Karachi, and I'm an artist, a visual artist. I make a lot of video and work with issues of aspiration in public space, in the construction of architecture, and sort of speculative realities in a developing city. I'm interested in this particular class because I've been working a lot with low-res images, And I think that they have a particular kind of power, an innate insurgency in them as these objects that have that. I think one of your articles actually mentions, you called it elegance, but there's more to it. There's a kind of power because they don't give everything away. And I'm thinking about my complicity as an artist in flows of capital, and how, artists in some ways can be considered sort of not so desirable and agents in society who are nonetheless complicit in the flow of capital. So I'm thinking about the insurgent potential of images, of artists as commodities, of images as commodities, or as agents that have some kind of power, some kind of innate power that's overlooked.
Great.
RT, do you want to go? If you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay. So hi, I'm Aarti Sundar. Right now,
It's very hard to hear you.
I think I just hold this. So I am right now in Chennai, which is on the east coast of South India, and I also work as an artist, and I live and work out of India right now. So currently, my interests revolves around how we experience this extremely interconnected governance structure that we have in place today. And I am actually very excited about this class because of late I've been looking at there's this new not very new 2014 onwards is this Aadhaar identity card, which is a biometric identity card that is linked to all public distribution systems in India. So I've been looking at how what happens when, for instance, it happens also with social media, how we sort of forsake one form of identity for the sake of another, but in this case to access real goods. And I'm also interested in what this does for dissolving of subject positions and what kind of politics arises from here, and what kind of image then is then formed at this juncture when infrastructure and experience sort of are inseparable, but also um, not, I mean, directly, but also not very directly affecting each other. And also in these images, what we sort of choose to depict in these images, by default or intentionally. Um, yeah. So right now, it's where I am.
Thank you. I'm going to also maybe speak a little bit about my own interest, because as most of you know, I use Facebook a lot. And for me, my Facebook work is sort of a compression. I always look at it as sort of like a compression practice. It's like, okay, how do you say things in this medium without going on, and how you can actually, I think the way I can characterize my interest is like, it's like the provocative and the intimidating nature of like a compressed message, because of its like quantitative, like smallness, right? Because it's literally small, it creates like a energy, because it creates some kind of threat, because usually like philosophical statements, they're qualified, and you have to say things in a certain way and talk about everything to make sure the statement is perfect, and by the time you finish, you end up writing 200 words. So when you try to have, for example, when you try to have a Facebook post that still has the color background, it's almost like if you're trying to get that color thing going in the background, it's like Twitter. You can't just go on and on, because at a certain number of character, the color of the background disappears and it just becomes text. So you're like, how can I say this shorter to fit it in so I can pick an image so impact. So that's what I mean. So for me, compression is something I think of all the time. I also am beginning to go back to Farsi Twitter, and as you know, Twitter doubled its length, but it's still very short. And I kind of like find these limits that social media have put on the length of content very productive in terms of like teaching people how to like say more with less words and letters, right? You really force yourself to think like because you know what I mean. In the old days, you basically paid for per word or per letter when you did advertisement in like classified, or you always had to think like, okay, I have a 5-bedroom apartment with all these features. What do I want to put in here in order to like not pay too much and still get the kind of like audience I want for my ad, right? So it's very much, I think it has, this kind of practice has its roots in like advertising, where like words and letters cost money. Yeah. So, and also the main mode of artistic expression where I come from in Iran has for a long time been poetry, before it sort of like switched over to a visual form with cinema and graphic design much later on. So yeah, and as we all know, poetry itself is a form of compression, and then as a form of compression, you immediately deal with the question of like sharper forms, because when your content shrinks, form also shrink, and then little changes or fluctuation in the shape of this form has consequences, right? So form becomes really important in poetic compression, right? Because you have so little, so you have to be very careful of how you use this little, right? How you use this little formal properties of your whatever it is, right? Your object of expression, right? So these are my interests, and I'm here. And also, as Jason's seminar description made it clear, I already think that completely along the same line, that left does not know how to basically use compression in its politics, and that's why it is in this limbo. And the right has been kind of like what is the right word? Like they basically made it their own. This medium in a way that now left started to actually apply ontological qualities to it, saying like, oh, any short message is potentially right wing, which is completely not true, right? Because
Right.
after a while, if right keeps using it, then we're going to associate them so closely that then the whole thing will become taboo, right? So I think part of my interest is also to make sure that insisting that compression is politically unaligned, as Alexander Galloway's favorite word, unaligned, and left and right can basically participate in political compression. It's just that right has done it earlier and with much more effect. So yeah, so this is sort of like the way I enter the conversation. Now, Giancarlo, would you like to speak also, or you want to stay silent? Because if you want, I can pass it on to you.
Let's see. Am I?
Oh, look who's in the house. We have an extra guest over there. Hello, Dominique.
Hello.
You guys, that's Dominique Fox,
Okay. Yes.
your commentator and friend. Hello. Great to see you. First time outside of social media, and actually you're a person. It's like when Reza first time showed up and everybody realized that.
Yes. Nobody even believed Reza existed for years, but he is a real guy.
Yeah, well, I never believed that you existed. So now I know that you really, all those like criticism of Laruelle and all these wonderful things you write here and there, there's a real person behind it. Okay, go ahead, Giancarlo.
Hi. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Jason. It's interesting hearing about the different ways in which compression can be used and can be thought about. I was just talking to Dom about the technical conception of compression, like from JPEGs to other
level zip and things like that. Yeah, I was just saying that there are some distinctions within the technical domain, for example, between lossy and lossless compression, which are probably worth teasing out a bit here.
Yeah, so we're interested in how a lot of these different distinctions in terms of technical terms and also philosophical conceptions and political conceptions of compression can be, so to speak, syncretically put together for, let's say, political discourse, technical implementation, and the like. So yeah.
I'll mention one other thing since it's on my mind. We've recently been reading through Nick Land's text on Bitcoin cryptocurrency, where he explicitly describes his own philosophical procedure, or kind of possibly non-philosophical procedure, as a hashing of the phenomenon of Bitcoin. And so he uses the idea of a hash function, which again is a reduction of data to a hash, as a metaphor for what his own process is in terms of drawing in the phenomena around Bitcoin from the Satoshi Nakamoto paper through to the Bitcoin as a technical and social phenomenon, hashing them down into something which then has this kind of philosophical representation. And you know, we're kind of thinking about how well that works as a metaphor, whether his actual understanding of hashing, you know, technically is kind of on point and things like that. But it's another dimension of this, I think. Producing a hash of something is not necessarily the same as compressing it, but it is making us a smaller representation of a larger field of knowledge for various purposes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's what Land explicitly says he's doing in his discussion of Bitcoin, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's worth talking a bit I think, about the metaphorical and analogical ways in which we can think some of these terms that come from a conceptual realm or are usually used on a technical realm, and then the way they transpose and like work in different vocabularies. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and we're hoping to hear what Jason has got to say and present.
I'm going to pass the camera and mic to Jason to continue. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, great. Well, and yeah, what you were saying, Mohammed, just reminded me of the last line of the Stern reading on, you know, his introduction to compression, where he says, you know, like the old existentialist line about death, understanding communication might start not with plenitude, it might begin with finitude. So, you know, I think a powerful way to think about political communication, for example, you know, the need to figure out how to meme correctly as a, you know, an imperative of the left today, perhaps. So, okay, what we might do next then. So yeah, I'm hearing, you know, an interest in art practice and how images and new media circulate right through global flows of capital. So maybe that might be the next place to go, and just sort of by way of, again, setting the stage, doing a bit of lit review and how compression qua you know, reified concept enters, you know, some of our critical vocabularies in critical theory, art theory, you know, continental philosophy, you know, that general field that we're all probably working in or coming from. So I'll just read a bit from my own writing here about you know, how compression kind of enters these vocabularies in the last quarter century or so. So compression enters the field of social and cultural theory with some notable political economic baggage that is worth unpacking here before going any further. In a key moment in compression's life qua reified theoretical concept, David Harvey, in The Condition of Postmodernity, laid out a model of time-space compression that proved to be highly influential in theorizations of postmodernity and postmodernism that were happening around the start of the last decade of the 20th century. Frederick Jameson's book, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, will come out the very next year. But while Jameson surveyed a wide swath of cultural production, including film, video art, architecture, and critical theory, applying his typically probing symptomatic readings to these various byproducts of late capitalism, Harvey's book from this period is more invested in the specifically geographic and temporal mutations happening in the period that is being marked as postmodern. Indeed, it is in the academic discipline of geography proper that the concept of time-space compression has arguably had the most impact. For Harvey, time-space compression describes the ever-mutating experience of the categories of these categories, i.e. time and space, by human subjects as the effect of long-term historical material processes that include the Enlightenment and the rise of global capitalism. Technological development, especially that of transportation and communication, has tended to reduce our sense of time-space. A widely reproduced diagram from chapter 15 of Harvey's book visualized the compressive power of transportation technology, for example, wherein the world map appears orders of magnitude larger from 1500 to 1840, when the best average speed of horse-drawn coaches and sailing ships was 10 miles per hour, compared to the depiction of the world map at the bottom of the diagram that depicts the world circa the 1960s, when passenger jet aircraft can travel 500 to 700 miles per hour. And you can sort of easily Google this image, I'm sure, where, you know, on the top of the image, the world appears, you know, fills up the whole page, right? It's appears vast. And then by the 1960s, you know, the world is much smaller due to communication, transportation technologies, right? So the world is getting smaller, this, you know, old chestnut. For a Marxist like Harvey, it is the expansion of capital itself that produces this time-space compression as it spreads over the surface of the world, looking for new markets, new untapped spaces to colonize. As geographer Barney Whorf points out, the thinking of time-space compression in Harvey's sense preceded his 1990 book, even if it did not explicitly mark it off as a meditation on compression per se. And if you're interested in a kind of synoptic account of how time-space compression has appeared in geography and related disciplines, Whorf's book is the place to go, which is called Time-Space Compression. Time-Space Compression, Historical Geographies, from Routledge, 2008. So for indeed, Marx himself understood the compressive power of capitalism, even if he didn't use this term. Whorf cites the famous passage from Marx and Engels' manifesto as a clear example of capitalist relations causing the diminution of humans' sense of time and space and the attendant relations between these categories. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this quote, but I'll just read a bit to remind us. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober sense his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. I'll stop there. This is me again. The world thus becomes compressed according to uniformly capitalist logics. Recall, too, that Marx and Engels are writing at a period of intense technological change. Vast changes in communication and transportation are occurring in the mid-19th century that will forever alter concepts of time and space. By accelerating the velocities of people, goods, and information, Whorf writes, the world is made smaller even as interactions are stretched over larger distances. As Marx and Engels indicate in the manifesto, and those who have followed in their wake have explicated, the compressive power of capital is unequally distributed. Time-space compression for some may be time-space expansion for others. So compression only tells half the story. As Worf notes, the term compression is therefore misleading. Every round of time-space compression involves an expansion in the geographic scale of social activities. The dynamic relationship between compression and expansion must be emphasized. The dual track of matter and concept this dual track of matter and concept has run throughout the intellectual history of time-space compression. Time-space compression, and this is a quote, time-space compression necessarily entails not only the physical movement of bodies through space and time, but also how people experience those dimensions symbolically. The process of folding time and space is simultaneously conceptual and material, mental and physical, located between meaning and matter. And yeah, as you guys have been saying, this dual track, meaning and matter, conceptual and material, is one that I explore in the dissertation, hopefully in the eventual book. And yeah, certainly something we can keep talking about in the course of the class. And it's really that two-track approach that I'm interested in, the conceptual, philosophical, and the technical operations, and how they kind of co-constitute this idea of compression that we can explore. These two spheres, meaning and matter, qualitative and quantitative, will be put into productive conversation with each other in this dissertation. As I just said. Writing about compression today comes with a unique set of challenges because the common sense notion of the term, inflected by a bourgeois consumerist sense of quality, would likely be considered normatively negative. Many prominent discussions of aesthetic value in media would have us desire richness and fidelity, not reduction and noise. Andre Bazin, for one, takes the myth of total cinema to be the mimetic desire to completely recreate the sensuous fullness of reality within the cinematic apparatus, ostensibly making the walls of the theater disappear. An artifact imposed by the infrastructure of the apparatus itself would interfere with that aesthetic teleology. Oh, was that Patrick Harrison that just joined us?
Yes.
Hi, Jason.
Hey, Patrick, how are you?
All right.
I'm just doing a bit of a lit review and general introduction to compression as a topic in social aesthetic theory.
Thanks. I was watching on YouTube, but
oh, cool.
All right.
Very cool. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, Bazin.
Currently have like 5 other YouTube viewers. So sometimes people who have to be in the seminar actually choose to just watch it on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, but there's five viewers on YouTube as well. So go ahead.
Is this productive what I'm doing right now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
I mean, I'm taking notes, and I would probably say a few words here and there. But I think it's great if you just continue on, and then we'll get to discussion maybe later. Great.
Okay. So yeah. Right. So we think about, there's a certain aesthetic teleology which we get. Stern talks about this well in the piece, right? A teleology towards definition, immersion, richness of experience, right? And that's a kind of standard aesthetic teleology. Bazin being one example, right, where there's this asymptotic trajectory where we might eventually achieve perfect mimesis, total cinema, the walls dissolve, etc. Right? Then cinema disappears essentially. The ways in which time-space compression have appeared in social theory, as in the examples above, tend to emphasize these traditional hierarchies, a vital world being diminished by the crushing logics of capitalist techno-modernity. This tradition of geotemporal compression takes on an apocalyptic tone in a recent work by Peter Sloterdijk, In the World Interior of Capital, where in a chapter titled The Uncompressible, or the Rediscovery of the Extended, he paints a grand narrative of the death of the dignity of distance, as he calls it, in modernity and into post-modernity. Once there was regionalism and a connection to one's local place, but no longer. And then here's a sort of a longer quote from Sloterdijk, but it's representative of this kind of, straw man maybe that I'm setting up here. But in any case, all this became one memory among many through the tacho technologies of the 20th century. Within 2 generations, telephone networks, radio systems, and jet engines and air travel caused the overcoming of distance to be taken for granted to such a degree that space was perceived as an almost negligible factor. As it could not offer any appreciable resistance to its rapid traversals, it seemed to constitute the basic area of being in the world, accommodating reduction, compression, and annulment almost of its own accord. In 1848, speaking of the revolutionary achievements of the bourgeois age in the second most famous passage of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels stated that all that is solid melts into air. To this, the sensibility of the 20th century adds, all that is extended and demands space is compressed into a minimal inert block. Intercontinental telephone conversations are the most obvious manifestation of this. Anyone who wants to see the myth of the disappearance of space confirmed need only reach for the telephone or perform a few mouse clicks. End of the quote. Sloterdijk continues in a mode that might be familiar to those versed in 20th century modes of cultural criticism descending from the Frankfurt School's critique of instrumental rationality. And then another quote, once distances are seemingly only there to be overcome, once national cultures only exist to mingle with other traditions, once all the Earth's surfaces only represent the immobile counterparts to their elegant collections as geographical maps and aerial photographs, and once space as such means no more than the nothingness between 2 electronic workspaces, then we can predict the direction which the resistance against these derealizations will take place. Sooner or later, the culture of presence will have to assert its rights once more against the culture of imagination and memory. The experience of the extended will defend itself against the effects of compressions, abbreviations, and skimmings. Just as decontextualized meaning has ultimately also always depended on being embedded into a non-omittable situation in order not to disappear entirely into abstractions, so too compressed space must be tied to the unspoilt experiences of extension if it is to avoid vanishing completely in secondary processes. This realization is articulated today by those who insist on the memory of the local against the decontextualizing tendency of universalisms and telemachines. So that's the end of this Sloterdijk passage, but I think you get the idea, right? This tone echoes much of the work of someone like Paul Virilio, the theorist and philosopher who took speed, velocity, and acceleration as his main topics of inquiry. The techno-pessimism of Sloterdijk and Virilio see compression as a qualitative difference in the vitality of life, decidedly a change for the worse. Okay, so the next passage maybe speaks again to this dual approach, right? The conceptual versus the material, the qualitative versus the quantitative. So I'll read this as well. And then after this, maybe we can open it up to comments and discussion. So this dissertation, but in this case, this class, in this dissertation, in this class, we can tell a different story about compression than the one we get in the examples just outlined. I want to emphasize a story because there are many others to tell alongside this one. I want to be expansive in one sense, working through a variety of modalities of compression, while also focusing on the ways in which the compression image is co-constituted by aesthetic and economic considerations from the dawn of digital imaging tools. So this is a time when visual culture or audio culture as well, arts, the field of art in general, I suppose, it's in an age of Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver's information theory, right? A time when it's imperative to understand image, sound as signal. And I think it's the next class, we can do a whole kind of side history of Shannon's information theory and how that is a important part of the history of thinking compression, certainly. So we'll do Shannon next time for sure. But is compression a metaphor or is it a thing? So hopefully we can consider it as both, a metaphorical concept and a technical operation. The advantage to thinking of compression in these terms is that it allows us to explore the theme in both its metaphorical and material sense. Compression will appear, as it does in the examples above from contemporary social theory, as a qualitative process that alters epistemological relationships to the world and produces mutation in the way in which semantic information is organized. As Reza Negarestani puts it, this is quality qua concept. So I'm calling this qualitative compression. Qualitative compression works to process the physical effects of the real. And in the cases that concern us here, render a signifying image or sound able to be circulated within media ecologies, adding to the new visual cultural apparatus of compressed images. I'm sorry, I'm reading from my own project, which is mostly about images, but you can kind of also put other media forms in here as well, right?
Absolutely.
What's that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So here it is essential to understand the specifically technical processes by which compression works on images to produce this new regime. We will therefore also consider quantitative compression, as Negarestani says, quantity qua number, certainty of number or digit. And actually I'm taking these terms from Negarestani's response to Alex Galloway at the what was that conference you had, you organized, Mo, in Vancouver?
Oh my God, that is so amazing. Thank you. That was called Incredible Machines.
Incredible Machines, right. Yeah, here's my citation.
Were invited and then they showed up. They were not, and that was the precursor to the New Center, where we first used this compression technology we're using right now called Google Hangout to run the seminars. So amazing that you go back to that intense debate in like end of Friday night before we went for dinner, where people took turn.
Right. Reza had some pretty strong critiques of Alex's presentation.
Absolutely. And
the critique was precisely on the grounds of collapsing these distinctions, by the way, right? He was accusing Alex of collapsing the quantitative and the qualitative, and Reza was insisting on this, cleaving them, which is generative, I think, for sure, thinking them apart, but how they might interact and influence each other. And incidentally, speaking of Google Hangout, the first video compression standards in the 80s were developed with the specific purpose of video conferencing, by the way. So the very first digital video codec published in 1984 was for video conferencing. So that's a media archaeological fact we can talk about in more detail.
I guess the video conferencing you're talking about was not meant for the digital environment, but for analog environment over the phone, right? But maybe we don't need to get into it. I'm just trying to think what kind of, but it must have been digital because codecs.
Right. It's early digital video essentially. But we can get into the details of that later. So again, to return to this distinction, right? Qualitative compression works to process the physical effects of the real, and in the cases that concern us here, render a signifying image, right? So it's this interface between the real and the symbolic, and precisely that moment when the real becomes filtered as a signifying symbolic representation. We will therefore also consider quantitative compression, as Negarestani says, quantity qua number, certainty of number or digit. To provide a rich account of a media theory of the compression image, both of these valences of the term must be aired. In exploring the modalities of compression images, qualitative compression will emerge as a lossy reduction of the real in the way, for example, that a camera captures some necessarily reduced fraction of reality. On the other hand, once the real becomes data, quantitative compression names the process by which that image data itself becomes quantized, deleted, and further reduced. Qualitative compression is compression of the referent. Quantitative compression is compression of the signal, the physical materiality of science, as Bernard Siegert puts it. Quantitative compression, like Samuel Morse's system of dots and dashes, is a form of data processing optimized according to technical criteria, that is, with no regard to semantics. And that's a quote from Kittler. We might say here, following media theorist Friedrich Kittler, that quantitative compression is writing something differently after its initial inscription. Let's see. Okay, so maybe just a couple more paragraphs to help set things up. So apart from the grand world historical claims about the power of compression that make their home in social theory and the Marxist geography of someone like David Harvey, the theme takes on a more specifically takes on a more technical specificity when brought into the discipline of media studies in recent years. According to Jonathan Stern, heretofore in this still rather young field, the theme of compression has almost exclusively been applied to one of two distinct technical processes. Data compression, whereby a large bandwidth of information is made smaller for more efficient distribution and storage, and dynamic range compression, in which the distance between the loudest and quietest part of an audio signal is reduced in order to have a higher overall volume. And in the Stern piece, he tells a nice history about what the incentive for that loudness, the so-called loudness wars was, right? Like in the old days, when you were tuning the radio dial, you would tend to settle on what was the louder stations, right? So you wanted to have the loudest possible average volume of the signal. And engineer John Watkinson clarifies of this latter sense. In audio parlance, compression traditionally means a process in which the dynamic range of the sound is reduced. In digital parlance, the same word means that the bit rate is reduced, ideally leaving the dynamics of the signal unchanged. Unquote. The various techniques for removing redundant or excessive and unnecessary data are collected under the rubric of compression, and the scholarly work that has interrogated the histories and applications of technical compression has typically engaged with it in this register. Both would be examples of what we are calling here quantitative compression. As the most prominent and thoroughgoing recent example, Jonathan Stern's work on the MP3 has shown how a fine-grained explication of the genealogies of a popular media format that uses specific compression algorithms can tell us a good deal about the hidden assumptions that are built into all of our media devices, the mystical kernels that are hidden from us as we interface with the rational shells of consumer electronics. What emerges in Stern's charting of the MP3 across a number of fields and disciplines is a shadow history of perceptual coding. That is, those assumptions that communication engineers make about how humans, the end users, will be interacting with technologies in their lives. We see how the development of technical standards takes place through the long history of the entanglements between perceptual science and the economics of communication infrastructures, the process that Stern calls perceptual techniques. Stern's work shows how an inquiry into a single compression technology can logically expand out into a series of nested concerns that ultimately speak to some of the fundamental questions of media and aesthetics today. What do we ultimately expect from our media of technical inscription? Do we value a high level of fidelity to some sense of the real, where media representations are judged not only in terms of their realism, but also in terms of their self-sufficiency, perceptual and definitional abundance, and immersive characteristics? Is the grand narrative of media as the advertisements for the latest 4K television or ultra high definition Blu-ray player might suggest, one of ever increasing verisimilitude. Stern's recent work on compression is a patient deconstruction of such assumptions, ones that cannot stand up, he suggests, to the several decades-long post-structuralist challenge to idealist discourses that would see the dream of technological media as being able to somehow reproduce the fullness of face-to-face communication. Instead of these fantasies of a media ideal, compression is put front and center in Stern's non-ideal media theory. He alters the primary terms of traditional media studies, revolving his inquiry around the axis of compression where it has traditionally been representation. And here's a nice quote from Stern. "This is not to say I simply want to replace a grand narrative of ever-increasing fidelity with a grand narrative of ever-increasing compression. I am merely proposing compression as one possible basis for inquiry into the history of communication technology, in the same sense that representation has served. We need to describe and debate long-term histories, as most of the currently available long-term histories of communication have not taken on board the insights of recent decades, especially those drawn from work on globalization, as well as post-colonial and post-structuralist thought. Such new histories would not need to function as a teleology, nor need to approach universality, but ambition and breadth certainly seem appropriate in our moment." So I hope to take up this project of using compression as a basis of inquiry into communication history in this class, with a special emphasis paid to the materiality of media formats and media infrastructures. What are the specific forms in which our media get delivered to us, and what kinds of aesthetic and political discourses attend to those forms and formats? So maybe I'll stop there and see if anyone has anything they want to add, or any questions or comments at this point.
Well, I'm gonna start because I have so much to say, and I just want to like get the conversation rolling.
Sure, great.
So, you know, the part about like the quote you read of Storage, right?
Yeah, Sloterdijk.
Yeah, Storage. The quote that said like basically his traditionalist view, right? That somehow this thing can go on forever because the forces of extension or extensiveness will take their revenge or somehow like return. Mm-hmm. But even when they come back, they have to use compression in order to get anywhere, because we have two examples of it. One was the first real anti-modern revolution in the world that took place late 70s in Iran, led by a cleric called Ayatollah Khomeini. And then you can also apply the same more or less to Trump, right? Or like this rise of the right. So Khomeini's message was, as we know, and I'm sure you've heard about it, was basically passed on in the time when his image and the mentioning of his name was still censored in the media in the first very beginning stages of the revolution. Basically, it was cassette tapes where he would make a very short speech, and then these would get replicated and copied over, and then anyone who got a copy would make copies and pass it on to other people. And so essentially his anti-modern revolution was aided by a form of speech compression, which was cleverly utilized by him. And by the late 70s, every Iranian had a cassette tape player. Most of them had those small Philips, those very famous Philip one. Yeah, and that's when I first heard his voice, was through one of those cassettes myself. And you know, you can also say, like, the way we talked about it, the way the right uses compression is totally against this trend that people like David Harvey and, you know what I mean, Marx, kind of like everything solid melts into the air. Yeah, but also everything that's already melted to the air goes back to the solid, but through a process that might involve some other kind of melting. So right. I'm trying to throw that and say, like, again, like, compression is like maybe even direction of it is unaligned. Maybe it doesn't always work one direction. Compression both ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's that's what I was going to say. I have other things to say, but I thought I should sort of like begin with that to just like address the first part of your presentation. I don't know what you have to say about it. It would be good to hear your response.
No, I mean that's an interesting case, and yeah, it's making me think that more work needs to be done specifically on kind of media formats in these local movements, right? Movements towards localism or populism, if you want to talk about Trump and recent right-wing movements. And yeah, there's this revenge of the local or revanchist move, which is reclaiming compression, which in Harvey is this move towards universalizing, cosmopolitanizing the world, right? And as you suggest, compression doesn't easily map onto this progress narrative, I suppose, and it can be easily taken up, for revanchist ends.
Just to move away from the example of Ayatollah Khomeini, he also is known to use another form of compression, very very unique. I don't know any other politician who had the need or use for this or has ever done it, and this was characterized very nicely and compressed. Basically, his practice was compressed itself by an Iranian writer, that he said that Ayatollah Khomeini used television as telephone. And what he meant was that under the condition where in the first stages of after the victory of the revolution, when there were too many groups like liberal Islamist, fundamentalist Islamist, pro-Soviet Union Islamist, pro-Libya Islamist were all around him. And basically he had too many layers and possibility of things leaking out. If he wanted to send a message to somebody else, he would compress it symbolically in a few words and include them in his public speeches. So he would use his television speech to send a particular message to a particular person, like say the head of judiciary, that this is my actual opinion, because sending it comprehensively through like conversation or meeting him or telling someone to tell might have leaked it. But going on television and talking to public about something, but then including a few words that these two have already established as a signaling system, would tell that person what he wanted to get done without all these levels of other people around them preparing for it and knowing about it. So he actually used this the very form of like qualitative, it's a different type of qualitative compression in a way, right? In order to bypass the spies and bypass people around him, to send a message to like a certain person in the government that had to hear that. And only that person could decode this message because it was actually on television. Almost like a hash, right? Almost like a crypto, like to go back to like what Dominique's brought up. Also, so to end that, also the other thing I was gonna say is that I'm writing an essay about the work of a friend who's having an exhibition soon, and I've been just recently looking into it, and you might be interested in this because I'm trying to think of like the photomechanical transfer. Basically, I'm writing about photomechanical transfer, PMT, and I think a lot of your ideas of compression applies to photomechanical transfer. And I don't know if you know what photomechanical transfer is. Photomechanical transfer was the technology developed by Kodak, and other companies had their own version of it, which was basically because when print media came about, as we know, it was mostly just type. And then when the images were added, there was a form of lithography, right? It was either lithography or other forms of printmaking that would accompany type in order for mass dissemination of images, right? So meanwhile, while photography was invented, right, and photograph existed, there was no real way of mass reproducing a photograph because to mass reproduce a photograph, you had to make a lithograph, right? Mm-hmm. And then it would be costly, and it wouldn't be like possible for a newspaper who wants to do it. So the technology that was developed, PMT, was in a way compressing the photographic information into a dot matrix of zeros and ones, blacks and white, in order for the black and white image to be printed, mass printed on a regular basis, right? And I think that is even, so to me, that is like the earlier form of compression that was image compression that was happening, because basically what PMT did was it would basically almost like an MP3, it would reduce the grays. It would reduce the grays and it would represent them to a system of like, if there was more white dots against the black, you get more lighter grays. And as the image got darker, you would get more of a darker, more number of dots until you get to the full black, which was like all black. And this is something that the print machines could do. And then to the eye of the viewer, it still represented a black and white image. I mean, that's what Liechtenstein paintings kind of like celebrate, right? Liechtenstein is all about that. The dots on Liechtenstein is kind of like the screen as a form of like image compression in pop culture. So I'm kind of writing about his work because he's using screen, and I thought this is the best way to write about it. So I thought of bringing it up to you and sort of like adding to your discourse, but also seeing what you think about it just off the top of your head.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it's basically like half-tone printing.
Yes, half-tone printing, yeah. PMT is basically the proper name for half-tone printing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I say in the introduction to the dissertation, right? Like in this project, I'm interested in data compression of moving images. But yeah, if one was to do the longer genealogy of compression images that predates kind of the somewhat arbitrary starting point that I take, which is like the early 70s. Yeah, you would want to talk about halftone printing, right, which revolutionized image printing in newspapers, say, right? And yeah, it's that developing this ideology of a good enough visual culture, as I indicate, right? It's certainly not as good as it could be, but it's what you lose in definition and aesthetic abundance, you gain in this revolutionary new ability to print images in a newspaper, say, when in the you really couldn't prior to the development of halftone.
So and as you know, PMT also had its own sort of like resolution problems, because if you wanted a better representation of the gray, you would increase the number of the dots, but then that meant your printing machine had to actually be good enough to be able to replicate those dots. So it was also a matter of like quality of the image you get. And that's why in newspapers, because the newsprint can receive a lot of dots because the ink spreads, and printing machine for newspapers are like low quality. You almost can see those dots with your eyes. But like say art printing and like better book qualities and better papers, the screens could be smaller, and then you would really sometimes even mistake it for a photograph, but you have to really look with a magnifying glass to actually see, oh, this one is also just zeros and ones. But it just like fools you into thinking that it's not, right?
Right. So yeah, I mean, you're bringing up questions of display and size, right? Bigness, smallness, resolution, all these interrelating issues, of course.
But the part that I'm writing about, actually, sorry, I don't want to take over, but I think we have time, and these are like important things to talk about. Yeah. I hope it is that I'm basically in the writing I'm doing, I'm basically talking about, I mean, it's very much inspired by the course description, and I know what you're doing and stuff, right? So, and you're going to get like referenced in it. But basically, the political paradigm that I'm seeing and describing in it is like how these intermediary institutions between power and masses have sort of like disappearing. It's another kind of like melting into the air. Like democratic technologies, opposition, mainstream press, right? That normally in post-enlightenment, they kind of like mediated the relationship between those in power and masses, right? like the withering away of these we're entering this era of mass politics, right? Where power wants to directly speak to masses, right? And basically bypass these institutions, right? For instance, my example is like under George Bush was still performing for the Congress, for the UN, for CNN, for Democratic Party, whereas Trump doesn't perform for these people. Trump performs straight for actual masses, right? That's why people in these institutions are like, can you believe what he's doing? And then he's like, doesn't even care because his primary audience, he's not performing for the Democratic Party anymore. He's performing directly for people. So the way this relates to your work is that compression is the necessity of this type of mass politics, and it has been from the time of the print media. So compression is the means or the tool. If you want to go mass or viral, you need compression. It's just without it, it's impossible to kind of like to crunch the subtleties and actually be able to like multiply quantitatively to the level needed. So it's a technology for mass politics. Like compression is a technology for mass politics. What do you think about that?
Well, no, I agree. And just look at Trump and Twitter. I mean, I think there's a strong case that he won, based largely on his ability to tweet, right? And the fact that his tweets had to be taken up by the older traditional mass media and talked about every day, and that became just the viral. His viral ability to put forth these, compressed shards of mediation, into the ecology. Yeah, certainly.
And perhaps this is why, even though this became very clear to people, with like, if it wasn't clear already, by end of 2016, this was very clear, right? But actually, it took another 2 years for someone on the Democratic side to do this, which is Ocasio-Cortez, because she is the one who's really compressing her message into like tweets and Instagram and all that, right? Mm-hmm. Necessarily, I think, because the centrist Democrats and the main machinery, they're not interested still in mass politics. They still want to constitute the middle. They want to bring back bring back these institutions that like basically they're reactionary in a way. Technologically reactionary, because don't tell me that they didn't know that if they get somebody, pay them lots of money to come up with like really short, sharp messages, they could gain traction. They just did not want to go to this populism, which we can just easily change it with compression, right? They did not want to go towards compression because they wanted to bring back or restore these intermediary institutions. But there comes in 2018 some young girl from the Bronx who's like, okay, I'm gonna compress and I'm gonna reach the masses, certainly because she's interested in mass politics.
Well, and interestingly with her too, I mean, and this speaks to this dynamic of that Barney Wurf talks about, as soon as you have compression, then you have to talk about expansion too, right? And they're always in this, dialectic with each other, I suppose. But yeah, with Ocasio-Cortez, right? If Trump is the Twitter president, I mean, she's really the first Instagram live politician, because I don't know if you've noticed, like, she's doing all these Instagram live videos, and people are watching them and turning them into memes themselves. But it is this durational, expanded form of watching, the live stream, say, that she's really capitalized on in a canny way too, right? So she's doing both and allowing people to then, pick moments from these more durational streams and make their own kind of compressed, remediation of her streams. So I don't know. It's we're getting these both in an interesting way, I think, right? The kind of Bergsonian duration of the stream and the the compressed.
She
dunks on Twitter pretty well too.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I just wanted to add another layer to the conversation, which is really interesting, of resolution. And speaking about Khomeini, speaking about the sort of mass printing in newspapers of the first images, there is, of course, this strange phenomena of authenticity that at one point was being linked to low-res image, right? So you had Taliban videos, terrorist videos that were grainy and brutal, and that kind of sort of low-res graininess was kind of a stand-in or symbolic of authenticity. And years pass, and suddenly ISIS starts producing really high-res, hyper-real images, and those are also meant for mass sort of politics, mass distribution. And so something strange is happening here, where if I were to think in terms of technology, it's like going against compression in the ISIS videos, and thinking of this sort of incredible sort of detail of the image as a kind of link to authenticity. And I just wonder how this sort of plays into, Khomeini on one side, Taliban terrorist videos on one side, and then, this kind of turn towards the high definition.
I don't know, Mo, do you have anything on the Khomeini?
Well, the thing is, if I just like off the top of my head, if I want to like wrap my head around this, I think, and you know what I mean, I just don't want to say me, but I have no other example, but what I've done. A year and a half ago, an artist, Naveen Khan Yunus, asked me to contribute a writing to a catalog of hers for an exhibition. And then I told her that I would write a piece of fiction about the graphic designer of the ISIS magazine. I wrote a short fiction story about the design environment, graphic design environment of the ISIS movement when they were in northern Syria, and when they produced this like very, very like low-res, very like low-res magazine. And then I based my story on the change that happened when northern Syria was liberated by the Syrian army, and then the operation moved somewhere in Turkey because that's where the funding and money was coming from anyways, and how the change from sort of like a basement of a house in an insurgent home with very low quality computers to Istanbul in basically a room in an office of a big media company, which was a shell to cover the fact that they have interest in supporting this kind of thing, change the look and the quality of the magazine. And basically in my story, the designer, basically, he came from a secular background, and then he was very fascinated by office newsletter look of very simple, boring, ugly, like basically he was into normcore fashion. And he said, I'm going to do a normcore design of ISIS magazine. And he used like all the ugly features of Microsoft Word. And he was like, I don't want to use bigger softwares. I think we can produce things faster, disseminate them better by using just like very basic stuff on Windows operating system. We don't need anything crazy, right? So he produced it on these things. And then basically for him, it also had a philosophical thing. He was like, to legitimize what we do, we should make it look business. This should look like a business brochure, but instead pictures would be explosions and like beheadings, but like we frame it in these ways that this is business as usual. That was his design strategy. When they took over the city and then the team was moved to Istanbul, and then he worked in this like super high quality advertising company with Macs and software and a boss who told him exactly what they want. He was forced to move everything to Mac operating system and up the quality. And basically he hated it because for him, he basically saw that there was no authentic thing in this fake revolution. It was all paid by these people. And he had created all these like, things about low res in his own head. And the big business was high res. And now they wanted him to do arabesque and oriental designs and give up this very simple like Donald Judd modernism that he experienced in his low res software. And he basically and then he just hated all these like Turkish hipster guys with like Brooklyn beards who were telling him, no, we need more flowers and more arabesque here. Come on, what is this? This is not Islamic. So basically, the story shifts what you're talking about, going from like this to that. But basically, it's basically this desire of blending it's like basically it's what MBS kind of like represents, right? Kind of like taking something off this ideology and this politics, and then bringing and presenting it a different way. I mean, for the kid, to mainstream it, you had to make it very simple and like newsletter like. Whereas for these executives in Istanbul, to make it mainstream, it had to become high quality, and it had to become like glossy, and it had to become arabesque and look like. And then this kid would write on text messages to his friend that everything looks like a 3-star vacation package from Sharjah and Dubai. That was his like joke on what it was like. You can't believe it. They're making me turn our beautiful revolution look like a 3-star vacation package from Dubai, and he hated it. And basically, he wanted to just quit and go back and just like give up the revolution, right? So yeah, so I think this is sort of like what's happening is two different approaches to how to make it legit. Again, it shows that this is two-way direction, as I was saying. You know what I mean? There's no political directionality to it, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Well, I would just add, and maybe this is obvious, but ideas around resolution and authenticity in particular. I mean, all these things are culturally constructed, right? There's no innate, natural, relationship between what we consider authentic representation. So I'm just thinking of this interview I watched with Steven Spielberg the other day, where they're re-releasing Schindler's List and talking about shooting it in black and white. And it had, according to him, it had to be in black and white because that's the realism of the Holocaust, representing the Holocaust, is that he only knows how to represent it. He only saw it represented in black and white, so he couldn't imagine shooting it in color. So that was the authentic representation of that history, was in black and white. But of course, unless you're severely colorblind, that's not how we realistically process the world in black and white photography. So it's really a form of what Alan Feldman calls media realism, right? It's the realism that is constructed through media regimes, right? So that's how I would begin to think about this question of questions around resolution and authenticity. Yeah, is the way that it's.
Could I add that to that? Could I add to that you're absolutely right about cultural constructions of resolution and authenticity, but because of the global circulation of capital, there are certain sort of standardized generic ideas about resolution and fidelity and authenticity that are permeating the farthest corners of the world now. So everyone has a cell phone in Pakistan. And what that does to ideas of authenticity is really different. It's really interesting to kind of imagine that maybe there is no local left anymore.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we're back to the Sloterdijk, really kind of apocalyptic, the apocalyptic generic, right? In like Alex Galloway's work, for example, we get this, emancipatory vision of the generic, but yeah, for this negative compression of time space, maybe capital is standardizing ideas that once were more local, locally constructed.
Jason, before we go on, Artie, would you like to ask a question or address the topic? Okay, I don't see her responding. Maybe you want to continue on and she can jump in later. Or Patrick, or Giancarlo.
Yeah.
Okay, Patrick.
I've got a question. Hey,
Yeah, I've got a question. I suppose it will require me to do more reading, but that concept of qualitative compression gives me a little. It's conceptually challenging to me because I suppose I suppose like if you're so qualitative compression, as you were outlining, it has to do with like how you produce a sign that has sort of traction on the reel, as it were. Yeah. And does that sound right?
I think so. Yeah, it's that interface between the real and the symbolic. It's precisely that translation or transition from the real to the symbolic.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm curious about is where
Which
from what
I would
perspective.
just add that's maybe why compression is more metaphorical in that way, right? Because it's not again, it's not precision of number or digit in the way that data compression is quantitative.
Yeah.
But it is a metaphoric reduction, right, of some sensuous vitality, which is being captured and inscribed in a way that is necessarily a partial, right?
Yeah, no, totally. And I guess that's kind of I guess that's intriguing and challenging to me, because I think the thing is, though, it's like when you're creating a sign, like you're not compressing the real into it, you're just adding another thing into it. And the traction that it gains seems to have to do with how it's operationalized in a way that allows the sign to, circulate and have a kind of efficacy in doing things to the real or at the level of the real. It's like you never. That's the thing about signs, is that the real is never in them. Like, you're making a kind of arbitrary correspondent to something you wish to gain, and if technological systems or cybernetic semiotic economy plugging that sign into, that is going to kind of determine how effective it was. How will retrospectively determine how effective it was is a form of qualitative compression. I mean, it also it invites certain. So it's like I'm just skeptical about how I feel like the metaphor needs more fleshing out. And I know it's not your metaphor, but it's, yeah, that's just what I'm thinking about, because that seems to be like a big part of this. There's a kind of fantasy to our kind of current technocentric moment in like media studies, where it's like we're taking a step beyond the kind of like post-structuralist take on semiotics by thinking about the physical hardware systems and infrastructures that circulate and do things with signs, and that gives us a different understanding of signification, and one that's more relevant to understanding our kind of technological sort of society. But there's also sometimes this Hitlerite kind of like fantasy that that we're able to craft signs that like kind of like directly do correspond to the real, but it's not magic because it's technology. You know what I mean? Or that's the fantasy, that it isn't magic, that it's technology, and so it's real somehow. So I don't know. I just wanted to point that out. It also begs interesting questions, though, I guess, that one could think about things like the iconographic and like, right, because like the icon attempts to figure like the real in the sign. Right, it's supposed to have a relation of like resemblance, which, see, like that strikes me as like qualitative compression, like the way the Chinese character for horse, like kind of vaguely in a shitty way looks like a horse. But at the same time, it's also just a unit inside of a linguistic system. So I don't know, maybe I'm sounding a kind of flat or even like conservative note, but somehow the idea of qualitative compression, it seems like a distinctly different metaphor, and one that need fleshed out in order to work hand in hand with quantitative compression as a concept for thought. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, those comments.
I think the Chinese character is more like media realism, the way Jason described it, right? It's like the sign tries to be as close as possible to the reality of the content, so it's not as arbitrary as other kinds of like semantic code, right? But I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an
maybe
interesting
it's
way.
not. Maybe, are you sure that the image is sign and not signifier?
No,
I mean,
but
how do you know? Because I mean, indexicality.
You know, if it's a character, it's a sign. But I don't know. I mean, we can go on about these type of post-structuralist argument. Is it sign or signifier? But I think for me that the Chinese character is a sign, and then by resembling what it says, it kind of like adheres to some form of realism.
But if you think about indexicality, you know, after the first photographs were made with light directly reflected from the object, all sort of shifts from that to the digital or even analog production with the lens, and it's become non-indexical. That relationship to the real is lost. So I don't see the image as a sign anymore, personally.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we could say at the very least the concept of qualitative compression really throws us back on a lot of these sort of Peircean questions of the typology of how a signifier is made and taken to have a causal relationship of some kind to the real, whether it's iconographic or indexical or what have you. It seems like it seems like qualitative compression puts us back in the realm of thinking about Peirce and his applicability to the new sort of cybernetic system of sign production and circulation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I realized when writing this dissertation and when thinking about this project is, yeah, the heuristic of compression, I think, in a generative way, brings us back to some of these, you know, fundamental questions of semiotics and you know, some of these post-structuralist foundations about sign, signification, etc. when, you know, recast as a theory of compression, right? And I mean, one thing I would say, maybe, I mean, you brought up Kittler and his tripartite, you know, gramophone film typewriter. I mean, those are all techniques of capture of what I guess what we're calling qualitative compression, but it happens in different ways, right? So the gramophone captures the real of auditory flux, and film likewise this indexical flux of the image. But significantly, you know, the typewriter is the symbolic monopoly, you know, the up to 1900, you know, this when these split, as Kittler says, you know, when we have the gramophone and film come along, cinema come along, the symbolic was the monopoly on representation. And significantly, you know, when we get to digital compression, it's everything becomes flattened out, right? It becomes transcoded. The gramophone as recorded sound and film as recorded image become transcoded as so many symbolic images, right? So that's where the symbolic becomes monopoly again, right? So maybe that, for me, I mean, that's maybe this historical conjuncture where the qualitative then has to be, you know, thought as always already quantitative once we're in the realm of digital compression, right? Because we are dealing then with you know, ones and zeros and necessarily quantitative symbolic signifier. So I don't know, is that helpful?
Well, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, that's thank you for sort of nuancing my posture towards Kittler there, and that's a good thing to keep in mind going forward. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, it's that it's the monopoly of the symbolic, right, which then splits into these three streams around 1900 as Kittler presents it. But then we the streams merge again, like Ghostbusters style, when we get to the general digitalization, as he puts it, right? So now the computer then subsumes those formerly separate streams. So these disparate forms of qualitative compression, again, however, we're kind of thinking qualitative in compression in relationship to these Peircean categories, and I agree, it's a little. We could talk about that more and flesh it out in more detail, and I probably will need to do that myself in my own work. But yes, certainly once we then get to this stage of general digitalization, the quantitative has to be considered, alongside. It's like all the qualitative and quantitative qualitative is always already quantitative in the realm of the digital, maybe.
Cool. Smart.
Okay. So RT is writing that there was some problem with her mouse, so she couldn't get the microphone to work. So she's asking, sorry, my mouse isn't working, so I'll type.
Okay.
Right to compression and authenticity, nostalgia, etc. It seems that compression is a modality of some sort, like a lens with which to view a particular infrastructure. So compression as like I'm trying to make sense of what she's saying, like a making sense device. Compression as a making sense device, I guess. That's what I'm trying to decipher from what she's saying. And she can always add more, and I encourage her to write more. But so basically, maybe happening as you said, Jason, earlier, and like neuroaesthetically, like what is a neuroaesthetic function of compression internally in the human cognitive system, right? And then externalized like any other thing through media.
Right. Well, maybe if we could table that, because next week I want to read the computer scientist and mathematician Gregory Chaitin, and he gets at this question. I think what the question is, which is, he says understanding is compression. Right? To understand something is you are already compressing cognitively a whole, a wide bandwidth of information and potentiality into a necessarily reduced partial bit rate of what you can then cognitively understand. So I think that's one way of thinking about it. And yeah, Chaitin for next time will talk about this in a provocative way.
Just for those who are watching and like all of us, the distinction here that Art is trying to make is like compression in as a memory technology, but also compression as a very like a understanding technology. Like, you know what I mean? So it's a two different aspects of compression, right? That you're tabling it till next week, but I just wanted to make this distinction that there is a distinction, right?
Right. Well, maybe that is getting precisely at this distinction that I'm returning to between the qualitative and the quantitative, the material and the conceptual, right? So as a storage technology, yeah, that's quantitative data storage, right? That's DVDs hold more than Laserdiscs.
Yeah. So I don't know, Patrick, what's wrong with that? That's a very good, we just went around and I think we found some answer for your question, Patrick. And thanks to Artie, in a way, by proposing this question. I understand now, I finally that Reza's distinction came to full understanding for me. It was compressed enough for me to understand it finally.
Right. So I mean, I write a lot about media formats, which is maybe bringing this down to earth in a way where, the consumer discourse around the introduction of more high tech media formats. The Blu-ray is considered an advancement over the DVD because of specifically the compression standards that are built into that format. So you store more data, you have the ability for higher definition playback, et cetera. So yeah, that would be quantitatively, better than previous formats. And right, versus the cognitive, semantic, semiotic processing, first-person processing of the world, which again we can appeal to various kind of traditions, cognitive science, Bergsonian / Husserlian phenomenology, right? Take your pick, but there maybe is a way of thinking about how we, phenomenologically move through the world that has something to do with compressing data as well.
But as you know, Bergson, in a very negative way, has something to say about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how come it does not come up at all in like a lot of phenomenological discourse? Anything even remotely related to compression, except like you said, Bergson's sort of like understanding of how sort of like time gets understood by human and then gets measured and all that he considered a form of, he doesn't call it compression, but at least he's pointing out to these processes, these double processes, right? One is when the external time become internalized, right? The consciousness time with the, and then the other one is like when time gets quantified, which is again qualitative and quantitative. So he has something to say about it, but nobody else in phenomenology kind of like, because I don't remember like Merleau-Ponty or Schultz or Husserl even going there. It's very interesting.
Right. Well, maybe that's the gambit that I'm proposing here, is to rethink the entire history of philosophy as a media theory of compression. I mean, that's obviously a grand ambition, but in that piece I wrote with Galloway, I mean, that's essentially what we say, right? Is to recast ideas of traditional philosophical ideas of representation as a kind of media technical theory of compression.
Now, Jason, you remember we met in the fall of 2012 in Alex's Deleuze course. We read like a lot of Deleuze. And the reason why I participate in that seminar was that I was told by people at my university that we don't have a Deleuze specialist and your project require Deleuze, and we don't have anyone who does Deleuze at our department. So you're on your own to find. And then I just stumbled upon Alex's post because I was already following him, stumbled upon Alex's post in the summer where he said, I'll be doing my last ever Deleuze course ever. And then I immediately contacted him and I said, hey, I don't go to NYU and I'm not like your student, but can I come to this class? And then I did, and that's how we met and all that. But Deleuze's cinema, he alludes to cinema as a form of compression, no? Or am I just getting it wrong? The way the 24 frames kind of like per second compresses the passage of time. Or am
I mean, again, you can kind of read compression into it, and the degree to which that's kind of a good faith reading of it, I suppose, is an open question. I mean, for I write about Deleuze and in particular the qualitative and the quantitative. So maybe just to cite, so this is actually from Deleuze's Bergsonism book. So this is early Deleuze writing about Bergson, and he is explicitly talking about qualitative and quantitative here. And this is Deleuze. What, in fact, is a sensation? it is the operation of contracting trillions of vibrations into a receptive surface. Quality emerges from this, quality that is nothing other than contracted quantity. This is how the notion of contraction or tension allows us to go beyond the duality of homogeneous quantity and heterogeneous quality, and to pass from one to the other in continuous movement. So that, I think, that should sound very Deleuzian to you if you know Deleuze, and maybe this gets to precisely this movement between the two that I think Patrick's question was, or my answer to Patrick's question was trying to get at, right? Is that there is this necessary relationship between the two, and this is something that Hegel and Marx noted, right? In Capital, Marx notes, quote, "The correctness of the law discovered by Hegel in his Logic, that at a certain point merely quantitative differences pass over by a dialectical inversion into qualitative distinctions." That's Capital Volume 1. So this is all to say that, yeah, I mean, I'm interested in precisely those moments where an act of capture happens, and the sensation is produced by a qualitative sensation is produced by contracting quantity, and likewise changes in quantity can at a certain point flip into a distinct a change in quality. So is that helpful?
Well, super helpful, but also, like, I just wanted to, like, remind myself that the discussion that we had in Alex's seminar was when I think both Deleuze and Alex compared, say, compression that takes place in animation, right? In animation, when you want to, like, you have keyframes and then you fill the in-betweens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Create the passage of time and like the illusion of movement, right? Whereas with cinema, as Deleuze remembers, it doesn't matter which frame you put, like any 24 frame per second, doesn't matter what part of the action it captures, once played together will recreate that time and gives you, once it's expanded, gives you the illusion of movement. Whereas say basically when you were describing how MP3 works, right, or how sound compression works in radio, it was very important to know, like, the highs and the lows, and then keeping the highs and the lows and then compressing. Whereas with film, you don't have to worry about, like, capturing a certain character or the actor in a certain move in order to, I mean, later on, and I'm sure you've written about it, like your text on what is it called? It's called, like, that crazy film that's about, like, going to Florida during the spring break, right? The type of shooting and editing in Spring Break kind of reverses that genericness of film, because it consciously play with that, right? But regular cinema doesn't care where action starts or ends, as long as the frames are distanced properly, 24 per second. Once you play it, it gives you the illusion of time. So the cinema's compression, I think, has to do with that. It's sort of like disregard for highs and lows, and just it compresses regardless. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the one thing that I would say is, about animation and keyframes, and we can get into this in a future session when we talk a little bit more about the technical specifics of certain digital compression formats, namely MPEG. I mean, MPEG is based on very similar media archaeological principles to standard, hand-drawn cell animation and the division of labor in, like, Disney animation back in the day, which is to say, like, the more experienced animators would draw the so-called keyframes, and then the animators just starting out would draw the frames in between, right? So it's about linking these pre-rendered keyframes together, right? right? And that's actually exactly what the MPEG video codec is doing, is essentially just sending vectors, instructions between the chosen keyframes, right? So everything in between is kind of just an instruction, a vector between keyframes.
So, but of course, there's no human agent here that picks the keyframe. There's an algorithm for recognizing the keyframe
Exactly.
and transmitting the shifts in the vector between one keyframe to the next.
Yeah, so it is. It's this interestingly, classic like media archaeological resemblance where the human is being taken out of the equation. Yeah. So what should we do next? Should we maybe talk about the reading?
Yes, I thought like before we go away, maybe we can talk about next week's reading, and based on the people who hear, if we can assign them to students to read and respond to, that would be great. If people pick up to sort of like present and then respond to the presentation.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
We do that in the New Center seminars. That's how sort of like the student participation is encouraged, and then those presentation themselves will become basis for some kind of a text writing and final project for the end of the seminar, right? So
Right.
It's crucial that we set that up, especially since the first class, there's no presentation in the first class. Most of the time is spent by the instructors. So yeah, so what are the readings for the next week?
I'm just looking that up now.
Given us the readings for next week as well, right?
I've got to scan one thing, but then I can send it. So yeah, next week it's Chaitin, and then this really important Kittler essay, and then the other thing I can the Gleich information, a history, a theory, a flood could really be more just sort of additional outside reading, because that's kind of like more like popular science, but very helpful, I mean, for biographical background. So I have to scan that. But
do you have the Kittler and the Chaitin text, like their name and stuff, on the site? And have you sent it to us? Do we have it in a folder, or you still have to send it?
I still have to send.
Okay, so I will be pressuring you to give them to me ASAP. But based on their, do you have the title at least, so you can paste it on the sidebar, so we can ask people to take them on?
Yes.
Do you know how to post to the sidebar, right?
Do I know how to post to the sidebar?
If you bring your mouse to the picture, a panel opens from the left, and then the blue one on the top opens a sidebar, and then you see questions posted and all that.
See. Yes, I see. Okay.
So kindly post the name of those, or the bibliographical information of the two texts here, and then with the assurance that people will get it by tomorrow, so then they can begin working on it.
Very good. So hold on, let me write this down.
Meanwhile, the first one is Kittler, real-time analysis. In the meantime, if Giancarlo or Artie or Patrick or Jhemini has some final remarks, that would be good to get them in before the class ends.
Ooh.
So,
Hello.
Yes, go ahead. Yours. Microphone and camera is yours, man.
Hi. I'm really excited to read through the Kittler. It's been a while since I've gone through the Kittler, and going through this, just investigating the concept of compression going forward. I'm very excited also as well as the framing the framing that's been happening here. I don't know. It's is this 4 sessions, Mo, as well?
Yes, it's actually 8 sessions. We divided up between 2. So there's going to be a 4th session now, and then we will announce the second module a little bit later for late January, early February, and then that will be another 4 session. But definitely the material is 8 sessions.
Yes, because I was just thinking that with Dom, he just left. The material is definitely up for like 8 sessions.
Yes, definitely. It's 8 session, yeah. So
And it's excellently presented as well.
would you be interested in presenting one of them next week, or should we try somebody else? I mean, don't feel like you have to, but if you want to, you're more than welcome to take one of them on.
Kind of excited about it, but also got a lot of work. Can I confirm?
How about this? You maybe just do a 5-minute response to one of the presenters.
Okay. Yes.
Just off what you've read and off what you get in that class, just compress it and pass it on. But that means that, Jhemini, would you be able to take on the Kittler text? I'll get it.
Sure. Yeah, I would like that. Yes.
I'll write it here. Jhemini will do the Kittler. And then, Arti, would you be able to do the other one by Chaitan? It seems like it's totally like your cup of tea. Chaitan is.
I would say epistemology as information theory is the more important one.
Yeah, no, but the Kittler, you cannot like just say Kittler is not important.
No, I'm saying of the Chaitans. I put 2 there.
I see.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to separate them.
2 Chaitan. Sorry.
So there's Chaitan, epistemology as information theory, which was actually in the first issue of Collapse.
Oh wow, really?
So I mean, that was interesting because Collapse, of course, a journal people probably know. They right out of the gate they come out with this Chaitan essay, which is really a kind of a compression of his book, which is Metamath, and it's the article version of the book. And yeah, it's this question of epistemological compression, right? That I mentioned that we get in Chaitan is in that piece in particular. So I would say of the 2, that's the one that we
and you have the PDF and you will give them to me.
Oh yes, of course.
Okay. Just also like people know, like Jason is like a bank of PDF. Like so many times in my life, I was saved last minute because Jason basically has everything and anything that anyone could ever have on PDF. You can make sure that Jason has a very legal and obtained properly copy of it.
Oh yeah,
of course.
Amazing. So okay,
many hours spent on ARG.
So yeah, so I think, and Patrick, maybe you could like Giancarlo also be a respondent, okay? If that's okay.
I'm absolutely up for talking in response to any of the presenters. Yes.
Okay, so I wrote you down as respondents.
Yeah.
In the meantime, you all know that we also have the Google Classroom. That's just like you can post anything interesting you want there. The conversation can continue on there. I added Jason to the Facebook group of the class as well. So sometimes instructors jump in and help. And, like if you have the PDF, Jason, you can also post it in that. It's called the name of the class, and it's a group chat on Facebook, and it has all the people in the class and those who are supposed to be here, but they're not there. They're all there in that chat box. So you might want to, like, if you can, give them to me. I post them there and I email them to everyone. These at least these 2 texts that people are going to present. We should get them ASAP.
Sure.
And
yeah.
Whenever you scan, and if you can give that to me also, that would be lovely. And yeah, I think we're done. I mean, we're a little bit short, but we can save it for later sessions, which the discussions will be more heated and will take longer. And sorry if I talked a lot. I'm really excited about this seminar, and
No.
we learned a lot.
How about this? I can read my reading of the Borges if people are interested in that.
Sure, why not?
As just as a maybe a way of
Closing.
And again, I also get back at some of these fundamental ideas we've been talking about: qualitative, quantitative, etc. And yeah, insofar as it's the only like short story that we'll be looking at, and hopefully everyone had a chance to read or reread it. So yeah, here's I start my chapter 1 with this reading of the Library of Babel, right? So Borges's story, The Library of Babel, describes a rather peculiar form of media storage. In this short text written in 1941, the narrator reports on the universe which others call the library, a space that is composed of an indefinite, perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries. And I'm like quoting literally from the story here, so just know that. This massive library contains countless numbers of books, countless but not infinite. The narrator explains each book contains 410 pages, each page 40 lines, each line approximately 80 black letters. There are also letters on the front cover of each book. These letters neither indicate nor prefigure what the pages will say inside. The mysterious narrator, like all those who live in this universe, regards the library as somehow supernatural. In order to grasp the distance that separates the human and the divine, one has only to compare these crude, trembling symbols which my fallible hand scrawls on the cover of a book with the organic letters inside, neat, delicate, deep black, and inimitably symmetrical. The regimented, mechanically inscribed letters, punctuation, and spaces of the books give semantic organization to the messy flows of human contingency and errancy. Borges has long been considered an important precursor to new media discourses. His short story, The Garden of Forking Paths, is often included in genealogies of web-based literary forms, most notably hypertext novels. Janet Murray, in an introductory piece to the New Media Reader, notes that Borges, quote, evokes a sense of flicker focus, of an individual consciousness constantly reforming itself, of an utterance constantly in the process of translation. The interactivity of the computer is prefigured strongly in The Garden of Forking Paths, a story in which Borges confronts us with a pullating moment when we become aware of all the possible choices we might make, all the ways in which we might intersect one another for good or evil. But while Garden may be the great Borges story anticipating hypertext, massive connectivity, and the perpetual becoming of the internet, the Library of Babel presents Borges's media theory of compression in miniature. Rather than the pullating moment of a constant state of growth and expansion, the space of the library is finite, enormous yet finite. Compression, we learn, imposes finite limits. In the library, all of human expression becomes compressed into 25 orthographic symbols. The original manuscript has neither numbers nor capital letters. Punctuation is limited to the comma and the period. Those two marks and the 22 letters of the alphabet are the 25 sufficient symbols that our unknown author is referring to. There is much senseless cacophony in the books, our narrator tells us, verbal nonsense and incoherency. But there is also the potential for every book that has ever been written to exist in this vast hexagonal archive. The library is total, perfect, complete, and whole. The infinite flux of literary experience has been captured in these 25 symbols, with all data flows, provided they really are streams of data, as Friedrich Kittler says, having to pass through the bottleneck of the signifier, alphabetic monopoly grammatology. The library is pure potentiality of knowledge. There was no personal problem, no world problem whose eloquent solution did not exist somewhere in the hexagon. However, there is a problem of media storage when one attempts to actualize that potential. The vast quantity of books, many of which contain pure nonsense, make it nearly impossible to access the knowledge that one is seeking out. The processes of compression have not gone nearly far enough. If Garden is Borges's great text about the World Wide Web, Library is his great text about compression. But to be about compression means that it's also about its opposite, incompressibility. As the theorization of ergodic literature seems increasingly like a historically circumscribed relic from the cyberculture boom of the 1990s, perhaps it is time for a different Borges story to open us up to a different regime of media theoretical thinking attuned to an era of big data and small files. Borges' story is concerned with textual compression, but it serves as an inspiration for the way I want to introduce techniques and practices of image compression in this chapter. And this is the chapter that I get into the most technical detail about MPEG and video codecs and the engineering of video compression, image compression in particular. This short story articulated two of the fundamental ways of thinking about compression that I will pursue broadly in this dissertation and with a specific techno-philosophical focus here, namely qualitative compression through a selection of the real of the referent, as we've been saying, and quantitative compression through number of the already quantized sign as a means of economizing media storage and transmission. Borges foresaw that the problem of media storage would become an urgent concern in the 20th century. How to deal with the increasing amounts of information that were being accrued daily at an ever-increasing rate across a range of different mediums. How can processes of digitalization and archivization keep up with this onslaught of data? And then I say I'm not going to be able to satisfactorily answer these questions, but this route through image compression is one way to approach these big questions. So hopefully we can in this class begin to think about these same these questions as well, and through again this dual track metaphor and material that we've been framing the class heretofore. So yeah, that's Borges's Library of Babel as a story about data compression.
That was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
That was wonderful.
Great references. Lots of amazing material came into the picture today, and people will be presenting next week, and I will be here too. And yes, so let's say goodbye and end the broadcast. Thank you, Jason. I'm just stopping the broadcast.